Good morning and welcome to Tuesdays with the Pilgrim as we continue reading The Bishop Who Ate His Boots with Chapter 4, Part B. If you recall, Reverend Stringer is on his way home to Ontario. We ended last week with his visit in Winnipeg and his departure for Ontario. His arrival in Toronto was a triumphal homecoming. He was met at the railway station by Principal and Mrs. T.R. O'Mara and others. At Wycliffe College, the principal, faculty, and students were all on hand to receive him. He spent an exciting 10 days renewing acquaintances with students and friends and taking part in half a dozen meetings and receptions. Then he left for his home near Kincardine. Here was the real homecoming, when his family and relatives and friends crowded around to greet him. His brother and sister George and Sophia had come to Wingham to meet him, and a good deal of mirth ensued when he did not at first recognize George. As they rode back together, the conversation was animated, and they exchanged items of news, and the returning missionary inquired about relatives and neighbors. Late in the afternoon, when the train pulled into Kincardine, the whole community seemed to be on the platform to greet him. His father, brothers John and Will, cousins Fuller, Graham, Caldwell, and Young, the Alexanders, Hugh Clark, and many others. After shaking hands all around, he drove away with his father, calling at the newspaper office on the way out of town. When they had reached home, there were his mother and sister-in-laws and their children. There was, he said, quote, "a glad reunion with tears of joy. Talked and talked all evening. All the family were there but Hannah. It seemed good to be home," unquote. His sister Hannah, during his absence, had married his old college friend, Thomas Francis Whelan, who was now the incumbent of Christ Church, Harrow, in the Diocese of Huron. For several weeks the returned missionary was busy picking up the threads broken when he went away. He lost no opportunity of talking about his beloved Eskimos and addressed meetings of all sorts in and around his own community. The trunks of curios which he had seen aboard the steamer at Fort McPherson had arrived safely, and at each of the meetings he would arrange an exposition. He had also sent home some native clothing, and would often persuade one or two of the young men present to appear as Eskimos. In his own home parish of St. Matthew, Kingarth, he agreed to give a missionary address complete with the display of curios, the proceeds of which were to be devoted to a fund for the installation of a new parsonage furnace. The arrangements were carefully made. The curios were arranged in the basement of the church, and those attending were brought in by one door, invited to inspect the exhibits, and then shepherded upstairs for the lecture in the church. Stringer noted that, quote, "those present were very attentive and listened patiently, apparently at least interested, to a lecture lasting for more than 2 hours," unquote. He also observed, however, that the church was only half filled. He was not sure whether this was because of the financial purpose of the lecture, which was not very popular, or because a prophet is not without honor save in his own country. It is also possible that word of his prolixity had spread. Christmas that year was a happy and festive occasion with a great family reunion. The family attended the service in St. Matthew's Church, Kingarth, on Christmas Day, and this was followed by a meeting of the Christian Endeavour Society in the basement for good measure. Their religious obligations thus fulfilled, they went home to a Christmas dinner to which 25 people sat down, including Sadie Alexander, Stringer's fiancée. In the evening he showed lantern slides of the north and talked about the Eskimos. Early in the new year, Stringer undertook deputation work in and around Toronto. During February, he went on a missionary tour through Montreal, Quebec, and the Maritimes. In addition to fulfilling many speaking engagements, he had been commissioned by Bishop Bumpus to secure more volunteers to work in the Diocese of Selkirk. In Montreal, he met Henry Alfred Naylor, a student at the Diocesan Theological College, who agreed to undertake work in the Yukon. In Toronto, he met Frederick Fewelling, who decided to respond to Bumpus's appeal. On his return from these deputation tours, Stringer spent some time in Toronto gleaning what knowledge and information he could to assist him in the medical side of his work. This included a short course in dentistry and some instruction in obstetrics and minor surgery. At the beginning of March 1896, he returned to Kingarth to make the final arrangements for his marriage. While in high school, he had formed a friendship with Sarah Ann Alexander, known to all her relatives and friends as Sadie. She was a bright and attractive girl, versatile, full of fun and the spirit of adventure, who sought an opportunity for service in a Christian vocation. Sadie Alexander, the daughter of Henry Alexander and Sarah Young, was born on the family farm in Biddulph Township, Ontario, on April 8, 1869, and baptized in Holy Trinity Church, Lucan, on June 27th of the same year. She moved to Kincard with her family in childhood and met Isaac Stringer when they were both in high school. Their friendship had ripened into what was known as a, quote, understanding, unquote, although they agreed to keep it a secret until he was just a junior student in university and she was still in high school. They corresponded, however, and when high school was finished, she accepted his advice that, quote, shorthand was the coming occupation for girls, unquote, and persuaded her parents to allow her to stay with an uncle and aunt in the Belhams in Toronto while she attended Barker's shorthand school on King Street. The course completed, she found employment in a lawyer's office, but before very long was offered a post as a stenographer in New York. This was indeed a startling offer for one who had so recently left rural Ontario, but after talking it over with Isaac Stringer, she decided to accept it for a month or so, as affording her an opportunity for seeing something of the great metropolis. The month lengthened into a year, and then she received an urgent appeal to return to Toronto since her fiancé had a weighty decision to make. Puzzled and a little apprehensive, she found someone to take her place for 2 or 3 weeks and took the train to Toronto. The question was simple but staggering. Stringer was thinking of offering himself for work among the Eskimos. Would she be willing to join him later on? Without hesitation she agreed, and they sat down to discuss the changed plans which would be made necessary by this momentous decision. They agreed that as they would be 2,000 miles from medical aid, it would be well if she could acquire some training in medicine and nursing. She returned to her post in New York, but as soon as the opportunity offered, she came back to Toronto and entered Grace Hospital at the corner of College and Huron Streets as one of the first probationers. At the end of the first year's training, Stringer, who was by this time at Fort McPherson, wrote saying that a sister of Tom Marsh, also a nurse, would be joining her brother that summer. Would Sadie like to accompany her? If so, Stringer thought it could be done at no extra expense. This letter is not extant, and there is no reference to the suggestion in Stringer's own diaries, but at all events Miss Alexander decided not to go. Her reasons were that Bishop Reeve had promised Isaac's parents that he would come out on furlough in 1895, and if she went now, it might not be possible for him to do so. Moreover, if she stayed at home, she could complete the training which they both agreed was so necessary. Having reached this decision, she continued her work at Grace Hospital and graduated in May of 1895, after which she entered the Deaconess Missionary Training House for a few months. Stringer's marriage to Sadie Alexander took place on March 10, 1896, at St. Matthew's Church, Kingarth. 4 of his friends took part in the ceremony. F.G. Newton, a former incumbent of Brive with Kingarth, and under whom Stringer had served as a student in Bayfield in the summer of 1891. Edwin A. Hall, who was the incumbent of Kingarth at the time of the marriage, James Thompson, incumbent of Kincardine, and Arthur C. Miles, under whom he had served his first student mission at Elmvale during the summer of 1889. Henry D. Alexander gave his daughter away. James Stringer and the Reverend T. Beverly Smith were the groomsmen. and Alice Blatchford and Rowena Alexander, the bridesmaids. The church was crowded, and after the ceremony many of the company attended the reception, which continued till 5 the next morning, at the home of the bride's parents. The young couple then packed their possessions, had their photographs taken, and left on the train for London, Ontario at 10 o'clock. The honeymoon, if such it can be called, was a busy and hectic affair. At London, following a missionary meeting at St. Paul's Cathedral, at which Isaac spoke, they were the guests of Bishop and Mrs. Baldwin. More meetings followed, and a day or so later they went by train to Rochester, New York, where they visited Mrs. Edson, the wife of the missionary to the Eskimos at Point Hope, Alaska. From Rochester they went to New York, where they enjoyed a few days of sightseeing, visiting some of Mrs. Stringer's friends, and giving informal talks on Eskimo missions. Returning by way of Toronto, they spent the next 6 weeks doing deputation work in the Diocese of Huron. His wife accompanied him, and Stringer used to say jokingly that when he did not take his wife with him, he did not receive a very warm welcome. The people, he said, wanted to see the bride who is willing to go to such an outlandish post as Herschel Island in the Arctic Ocean. And that's the end of Chapter 4. We'll continue next week with Chapter 5. Until then, take care, stay safe, and God bless.